Hello and welcome. We are about to embark on a journey to a place that largely escapes public notice. Only rarely does the public see what goes on in the courts and trials process. This is the first of 9 episodes designed to explore whether the criminal court system provides an illusion of justice or does it actually provide justice. After this first episode where we introduce the courts and trials process and ask some very important questions about it, we'll move on to looking at the court process overall. Then we will look at the 3 court actors, the defense attorney, the prosecutor, and the judge. Then we will look at the stages of the court process, the pretrial process, the trial itself, and then finally the jury who makes those decisions. The last episode will attempt to answer the question of whether we have only the illusion of justice or whether we actually provide justice. We're going to start looking at Making a Murderer. It was a documentary produced by Netflix and several years ago. We're going to discuss Jerome Buting, who is one of the attorneys in the book on the case. He wrote a book about his experience and whether the court system provides merely the illusion of justice. Does what the court system preach and what it practice, are they actually the same things or not? Right? There are 3 main values that underlie our courts and trials process. The first is the presumption of innocence. Right? When we are going through school, we learn very quickly that there is a presumption of innocence, that we are presumed innocent until proven guilty. There's a question that Buting raises whether that is actually the effect or not. Stephen Avery, the defendant in that case that Mr. Buting handled, Mr. Buting argues he was presumed guilty, that the judge, the prosecutor, the police, the jurors all entered that case with a presumption that Mr. Avery was guilty, and they forced the defense to prove that Mr. Avery was actually innocent of the crime. This resulted from a collaboration of factors that both from where Mr. Avery lived, Mr. Avery's background, the fact that Mr. Avery had been tried and convicted once before, even though he was later exonerated, the fact that Mr. Avery was suing the police department that investigated the case. All of these different factors coalesced around this idea that Mr. Avery was presumed innocent or presumed guilty. Unfortunately, that Mr. Avery's case is not the only example that we have, as courts on a day-to-day basis continue to process cases rather than inquire into whether people are guilty. We have innocent projects across the country that on a regular basis are finding people who, according to DNA, are actually not guilty or innocent of the crimes that they have been incarcerated for. And this has created a presumption of guilt that operates in our system rather than the presumption of innocence. Second major piece that we have to our court system is the right to counsel. The Constitution guarantees everybody the right to an assistance of counsel to help their defense. Do defendants really get this right? Do they really get the assistance of counsel? Mr. Buting argues that for many defendants, that right does not exist. That when they do get counsel, to have effective counsel, it costs an exorbitant amount of money. That the people involved in the system are working on so many cases, they cannot possibly represent adequately all of those people. And as a result, some people fall through the cracks. Justice is not served in every instance. Instead, people are led through the process in order simply to plead guilty rather than to seek out innocence in the case. The final cornerstone of our court system is the right to a trial. Everybody has the right to a trial. to determine if they did in fact commit the crime for which they are accused beyond a reasonable doubt. In our system, however, less than 10% of all criminal cases ever see a trial. Both prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges work together in order to obtain guilty pleas where defendants admit that they committed the offense. As a result, there is no thorough investigation into whether or not the investigation performed by the police actually found the right person, or whether the prosecutor made the right decision when charging the case. Juries rarely see what happens in cases. All of these things have led to results, according to Mr. Buting, that are unrealistic and unjust, that are unreliable or unjust. In terms of reliability, we have found that cases simply get the wrong result. If you look at Stephen Avery's first case, he was accused of sexual assault in the 1980s. He was convicted primarily based on a hair sample, not because of DNA, but because a chemist went into a lab and compared Mr. Avery's sample with a sample of hair that was found on the victim. By looking at those samples, he said the hair were the same, and therefore Mr. Avery must have been the person who committed that crime. For better or worse, 15 years later, DNA left at the scene was compared to Mr. Avery's, and they found the DNA was not Mr. Avery's that was left at the scene, and as a result, Mr. Avery could not have committed that offense. As a result, our system creates unreliable results. In addition, they are unjust. Right? They are not just wrong as a matter of fact, they are wrong as what a fair and equitable outcome should be. Now, in order to determine if we actually provide an illusion of justice or simply justice, we must determine what is justice to begin with. And this in and of itself is a contested term. The illusion of justice is one where we exonerate people who are wrongly convicted, according to Mr. Buting, but that is merely an illusion because an injustice has already occurred. That person has been convicted wrongly in the first place, even though the system did everything that it was supposed to do. And so we need to figure out what is justice. There is no set basis or set definition of justice. Different people are going to look at the same case and see justice differently. They're going to define it differently. For example, in the Avery case, Mr. Avery, in his murder case, of which the documentary describes, is ultimately found guilty. But if you speak with Mr. Avery, if you speak with Mr. Avery's family, if you speak with Mr. Avery's attorneys, they will tell you that that outcome was unjust. However, if you speak with the prosecutors, if you speak with the jurors, if you speak with the judge, they will tell you that that outcome was just. And so you see, we have different perspectives on the same exact case. We see this as well recently in Ferguson, Missouri, where the officer was involved in shooting a black male suspect. Many would say that shooting was unjustified and uncalled for. The district attorney presented the case to a grand jury, and the grand jury said there was not enough evidence to indict the officer. The residents of the town protested this. Others supported the police. Ultimately, the prosecutor lost the next election. Was this justice? Was justice achieved anywhere in this case? We don't have an answer. We need to understand what justice is and come to a consensus definition. What are some possibilities? Well, some will say justice is simply following procedure. That if we follow the court process the way it was designed, the way it was laid out, then justice would be achieved. Others will say, no, justice is about finding truth. We have to find out what actually happened. And when we find out what actually happened, then we will be able to have justice. Others would say, no, it's not about the process or about truth. Instead, it's about protecting the rights of the suspect or the defendant. Our Constitution gives defendants certain rights, and if we follow our process and make sure that they have those rights, then the outcome by definition will be just. Others will say we shouldn't emphasize the defendant so much, but we should focus more on the victim. We should look at the victim and make sure the victim feels like the outcome was just. And by giving victims particular rights, then we will achieve a just system. Others may say, no, it's really about the outcome itself. Justice is a long prison sentence for someone convicted of murder or rape. Or justice is rehabilitation or treatment for someone who is convicted of a smaller crime. Without having this universal notion of justice, is justice even achievable? That is something that we will be addressing and we need to be thinking about as we continue to explore this court process. And so that also raises our next question. What is the goal of the criminal court system? What do we hope to see at the end of the day once our system is complete in any given case? Do we want justice in every case? Or do we simply want to find the truth? Can we find the truth in any given case? Should that be our top priority? What about simply convicting somebody? If we get a conviction at the end of the case, is that the goal of the process? What if we have nothing to do with truth, justice, or convictions? What if our goal is to be as efficient as possible, to handle as many cases as quickly as possible so that we can move people through the system? For some, that may not be fair. Right? Is fairness the goal that we have in mind? Do we want to have a system where both sides are equally heard, where they both have the equal chance of winning at the end of the day? That is a question that we need to address. And finally, perhaps the goal of the system is simply profit. We don't want to lose money as we go through this system. And perhaps if we charge our defendants more money, we will be able to make more money through our court system. Throughout this semester, we are going to address these questions. We're going to be using these questions as the foundation as we explore these different topics. The class seeks and as we look at these questions throughout the semester, keep this quote in mind from one of the best movies you have never seen, Night Falls on Manhattan, where Andy Garcia plays a prosecutor. He is speaking to a new group of assistant prosecutors. And he says, I don't have to prepare you for a job where the circumstances are black and white. We're going to be living in the gray areas, and that's a scary thing to ask of you. So good luck, and good luck working through this process.